welcome to the Forward Thinking Podcast. It's Chrissy here. And I feel like I always say I'm joined by special guests, but really today I'm joined by probably the most special guest, which is all of the CS2 team. Today is our 100th episode of the Forward Thinking Podcast, which is amazing. And I feel like has gone so fast. And but this podcast has brought a lot of insights to everyone in MOPS, and I thought it'd be fun, and Charlie and I thought it would be fun if the whole team came on and said, one of their own lessons or tips and chat through all of that and hear from the brilliant minds here at CS2. So welcome, everyone. Okay. So we're just going to kind of go around the horn, and I'll kind of kick it off to the first person and just chat about things. So this is insight into even kind of our weekly calls when we meet with each other and chat about things. But today more focused on giving you our best lessons that we've learned in B2B marketing or operations. So, all right. So I'm going to kick it off to our probably most veteran podcast guest, still one of our most popular episodes to this podcast is our attribution episodes, but none other than Allison Rouse. So let's kick it over to you first.
Hey everyone. As Chrissy mentioned, I did an episode on attribution, and so my tip is about attribution. It's a very hot topic in 2021 and will surely be one in 2022. But my favorite tip about attribution specifically is about its use case overall. Oftentimes, our clients and folks in the marketing ops community are using that data to try to prove their contribution to pipeline and revenue, when really that data should be used to improve your contribution. So really analyzing what tactics and channels are working versus not working, and doubling down on what is, and kind of reallocating your investments based on what's not working. Another thing related to attribution, there is a lot of times people are really focused on the total dollar attribution, when there's other metrics that can be used in addition to that to really hone in on what's working and what's not. So we talk a lot about influence conversion and influence velocity and influenced average deal size. So one example I always give is that, you might find that some campaigns, while lower in the total dollar amount influenced, are actually really good deal accelerators. So looking at not just, the dollars that are influenced by a particular set of campaigns, but how quickly those opportunities they're influencing are making their way through your sales process. So yeah.
Yeah, great tip. Hot topic of attribution. So it's no surprise that those are some of our top episodes. And I think the biggest takeaway or tagline that a lot of people have taken is what you said, is like to improve and not prove. So I feel like it needs to be one of those mantras that people say to themselves over and over as they're going through their attribution. Charlie, I know you probably have a comment on this.
Oh yeah, it's definitely the hottest topic around. But I was going to just ask Alison a question, maybe to dive a bit deeper. So, what's your perspective on if a company is trying to prove everything with attribution, and they've been led astray and they've kind of lost their way? Like, what is the best way for them to start trying to think about attribution in this way? And try and kind of correct the issues with their thing around attribution?
Well, I think it's kind of going back to looking at multiple metrics, because usually when they're trying to prove, they're looking at just that dollar amount, and it's going to depend on what model you're using. So like an even spread model or a U-shaped, or as the statistician George Box would say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I actually feel like an even spread model is a good one to use to find the tactics that are working, the tactics that aren't. So it's more about moving away from just like looking at the total dollars that marketing is influencing, and then honing in on like one metric that I really like to point people to is, you know, if you're looking at all of your different channels, look at them in comparison to each other when it comes to a specific metric like influence conversion. So if you look at all your channels and you say, okay, this channel influenced 101 opportunities and 100 closed opportunities and 10 of them were won, versus this other one influenced 50 opportunities, but 25 of them were won. Even though the second channel influenced less opportunities, it had a higher conversion rate. So you could kind of infer that maybe that channel is a bit more effective. Doesn't mean necessarily the other channel you should not invest in, but you should dive in a bit deeper as to what's working within that channel and what's not. So kind of moving towards that multiple metric mentality rather than just the dollars.
Totally, yeah. And I think a lot of what I see online around the hate with attribution is it's because they're kind of making this mistake. They're trying to prove this is the thing that, created this opportunity, and that's exactly right and it's correct. And when they're trying to do that, there's just so many issues with that, because like you said, every model is kind of wrong. Everything's wrong in its own way. You have to look at your data from lots of different angles and try and tell the story to try and figure out what's happening. But then the people that try and kind of find that very binary, just obvious campaign, like this is the thing that did it. Then the counteract, like people who end up kind of disliking attribution because they end up seeing the problems with that. But then they go too far the other way and then go, okay, well, attribution is completely wrong. I don't even want to do it anymore. It's just it's not right enough for me to be able to trust it. But then there's a middle ground where you need to also interpret the data and look at it in these different ways, like you mentioned, and build that story to try and understand really what's happening and the way to improve your marketing. And you don't need the whole, you don't need to have everything perfect to be able to improve your marketing. A lot of times attribution, I feel, can tell you more about what's not working than what's working. And that's why, you should be trying to focus on it and finding, the data, building the data models and understanding how to utilize it and not just give up on it. Which is kind of like, it seems like the conversation online these days is just whether you should 100% do it or just 100% give up on it. And it's like, try and kind of meet in the middle and just use it appropriately.
Totally. I think my last thing on that, just going into 2022, when everyone's talking about like the dark funnel and everything like that, I think one thing, Allison, it reminded me of was your podcast episode on the analytics framework. And one thing that we were stressing is just around like educating the people that are ingesting the reports, especially your leadership, and letting them know that just because something isn't present here in our reporting doesn't mean that we shouldn't be like, it's not good to do. So like there's a lot of limitations in some of the ways that we do our reporting. Some things are just not really great. There's different ways you need to get that data, or it's just not really reportable. And so it's, to use common sense, but also like understand that. And it doesn't mean that you do away with one way of looking at your reporting. It's you just try and make the best decisions you can based on what you do have. And just because it doesn't show up on your dashboard doesn't mean that you stop doing it. All right, so let's kick it off to the next person. So Christy, what do you got?
Yes. So mine is a little more broad, but it's more about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. So for me, like as a type A person, I like everything to be like in a very nice and neat format, easy to understand everything. But a lot of times you're going to come into either a new organization, or for us, it's like getting a new client, and things are going to feel a little chaotic. Like you don't know everything that's going on, and there's a ton of different areas you want to improve, and you kind of want to do it all at once, probably. So kind of just getting comfortable with the fact that you can't do everything all at once. You're not going to be able to make everything 100% perfect on day one. And so one of the things that can help with this is just having a roadmap so that you know all the areas you want to improve, and just put them on the roadmap and schedule them, because that way, it's like, okay, it's fine that it's not done now. We have it on the roadmap. We know when we're going to work on it. And that can kind of ease your mind a little bit.
Totally. I feel like, I don't know if anyone else has been like this in MOPS, but I feel like in some cases, when you do have that personality type, especially early on in my career, when I went into a less than perfect instance, my bosses will be like, stop trying to boil the ocean. Because I would just so harp on like making something perfect. And like, it would slow me down because like progress, is better than perfection in most cases, like especially with MOPS and in startups and getting things done. But yeah, Matt, did you have something to say? Because I saw you smirk, so I don't know.
No, just an imperfect
resonated.
An imperfect instance. Nobody's ever seen that before. Yeah. So.
And I think as consultants too, MOPS people internally, you're basically an internal consultant, but you have to also be okay coming to terms with you might not be able to do exactly the way you want, or things might not be exactly like perfect, and it's finding compromise, but knowing like what's best for the business at like that moment. And so I like what you're saying, Christy, because I think it's understanding that like, yes, you might not do this now, but maybe one day you will be able to. And then also not feeling like if you're not addressing everything at one time that you're not progressing. So
yeah, it also helps like just with prioritization to see everything on the roadmap, and then you can bring that to your boss or whatever and say, here's all the things I want to do, what's the most important to the business, and make sure you're working on the highest priority items first.
For sure.
Yeah, one saying I like a lot is something along the lines of don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And that's so true in MOPS, right? You can try and get this one thing perfect, while if you got a lot of things good, that's going to be a better result than just trying to get this one thing perfect.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, so the next one, Ruben, our newest member of CS2. So what do you got? And probably newest to the world of marketing ops. So I think this will be an interesting lesson that you've already learned, because it means you've learned it really quickly.
Absolutely. So this is a kind of a lesson that I've learned, but also I think a tip that would be very useful for a lot of people like me just starting out their journey in MOPS. But I think it's kind of universal as well. So as someone who has previously had experience in B2C digital marketing transitioning to MOPS, the main thing that I realized is I really have to pay attention to detail. I think anyone in MOPS can agree with this. So we all know what it's like to, be in a specific process and then realize, oh, wait, you know what? I need to go back and do that again, or just get some more clarification from whether it be, the manager or director who provided this task for you, or stakeholder who's involved, or perhaps someone internally who put in a ticket or something like that, depending on your environment. So being methodical and paying attention to details is super essential. But I think some ways to preemptively do that is, if it's something new, really lean into requirements gathering and understand, what is the goal? Why is this being done a certain way, or should it be done a certain way? And really lean into that. And I think once you have that as well, as you get through that methodical process, be sure to test your outcomes. Be sure to kind of comb through, double check, triple check, and be sure that you're at a good spot with it. So you don't, you want to make sure that you are effective rather than efficient, kind of like what, we were just talking about with don't let perfection be the enemy of success. You want to have a good work. Sometimes it's not always perfect, but the journey is getting better. So a good way to do that, I've learned, and I think especially for people who are new to MOPS, but everyone can relate, is paying attention to detail and making sure you have a good process underneath you as you do that.
You said something in there that really stood out to me too, which is the importance of the requirements gathering. I feel like something I've learned sometimes the hard way, and hopefully less the hard way, every day that I'm in MOPS is that you're going to have to gather those requirements. It's just a matter of when. So if you can get it all out of the way at the front end, then your first draft will be much better, and it's going to be a much more pain-free journey. But if you don't do it at the front end, you're going to get your draft done, then you're going to go back and revisit, and there's going to be a bunch of things that don't fit, and you're going to have to then check your requirements at that point and redo and spend more time, and there's going to be some headache. So,
Right.
Yeah, definitely
It's
important.
completely agree. As much as we all like to, talk to or use Slack to communicate with our teammates, sometimes we don't want to have that endless Slack channel going back and forth and getting those requirements later. So absolutely agree with that.
Another thing that I would say too, when paying attention to the details that you mentioned as well, is testing. And one of the things that we always recommend when testing is like, don't just test the thing working, test the inverse of that. Like, so test, the success scenarios, but test also like, well, I don't want this thing to happen when, this happens, but I do want it to happen in this scenario. Because oftentimes I feel like that's where, down the road, once we realize we didn't check that, something gets fired off when we didn't intend to, because we didn't test the negative. We only test the positive.
Right. Yeah. Being prepared for anything, whether it's, success situation or not. And, a live environment's always going to be different than the test environment. So coming in from every angle is super important. I agree.
Yeah, Ruben, I remember when you first started and I was like, oh, we can't do this because then this, and this is going to happen. And you were like, oh, wow, I didn't realize like so many of these things are interconnected, and that if you do one thing, it's going to like affect all this other stuff. So.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Seriously.
Yeah, that's actually a very key skill in MOPS, especially as you get more and more experience, is that being able to see, if I change this one thing, what's the 25th thing down the line that's also going to be affected by that one thing. And the more and more you do it, the more you realize how everything is so interconnected. And then it almost makes you kind of, you don't want to get too overwhelmed, because it does, everything you're doing does affect so much, but that does end up making the result better because you've taken into account everything. And one thing that all of you mentioned, I think that's important to highlight, is how you can kind of not hack attention to detail, but ensure it's enforced through good process on how you're going about your I don't want to say like project management, but more kind of the feature development or the development of the work. And that's what we've been focusing on a lot with CS2's. So like Matt's point, really making sure you have steps in your process to gather those requirements. And then to Alison's point, really making sure you have steps to QA properly at the end before you're going to be deploying. And if you make sure that everything you're doing goes through those steps, then you're forcing yourself to have attention to detail along the way. So yeah, this is a great topic and very, very critical for MOPS people to focus on this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think my final thing on that is also, it's a great lesson for leaders, or, like what Christy said, she talked about, she explained, okay, what are the next things that it might impact? But I think also if you give a certain task, like providing that full picture is a really great learning lesson, because at the same time you want to learn to those like tactical things, but knowing what big picture it plays into is actually a better learning lesson, because that's, the end goal is like knowing and owning that whole process, not just a portion of it. So definitely for leaders, instead of just like giving a task, talk about, how does this affect, who is this impacting, why is this important to, the business that we're delivering it to. So make it that big picture, and then it just makes that task like more valuable. You realize, oh wow, I didn't realize this one little thing that I thought seemed simple was actually part of this really important process. So,
and it's a lesson for leadership, both whether they're a MOPS leadership or not, and maybe even more so for not people who don't really understand MOPS, maybe like the CMO or someone who's like passing down what they want and it's having to be translated into, MOPS work, is how you give them the team time to work on a lot of these projects. You can't rush things. You can't skip, like Matt says. You pay those bills whether you pay them before you start or at the end. It's the same with QA. You pay the bill before you launch or you pay it after you launch, because you either do all the work to QA before you launch or you find problems post-launch that you then have to fix and then deal with. So you always have to pay your dues in the work, and getting it done beforehand is just going to make it go a lot smoother. People are going to trust you more because it's not like you're releasing things with lots of problems and issues that you're having to address after the fact. And it's just going to make the whole process just way more cohesive and streamlined, and the result's going to be far better in the end. So that's one of the things we've kind of talked about in a post recently about just taking time. Like MOP teams need to slow down a bit, not just go straight to that build phase, because it's very tempting to be like, we need to get this thing done. I'm just going to go build it without actually going through like strategy, design, and everything, pre-actual build. There's several steps before you should actually start building stuff.
That's one of my 2022 resolutions, is to slow down.
Yeah, it's a good wobbly in life and work,
Yeah, I will say one person on this team who's actually next, but I will say that is great at monitoring is Nina. You always remember to go back and like monitor. And I will say that like that is super important, because I feel like, what we do in MOPS, a lot of the projects are, they don't just end on that day that you deliver them. There's a lot of things that might come up that we're not expecting. And so I think when you also educate and say like, okay, we're going through a postmortem phase, or we're monitoring, like setting that expectation to the person you're delivering it to know like there might be things that come up, and let's have that feedback loop, and I'll also be looking at it. And Nina, I always feel like you do a good job of that. But let's kick it over to you, Nina, into your tip and see what you got to say. You're one of our avid listeners, forward thinking. Yeah. I don't even know if you've even like skipped an episode. So
no, yes, that's why I'm so excited to be on, because I've pretty much listened to almost all the episodes. So and all the ones in 2021. I'm excited to be on, and I think it's a great attention to detail is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about next. And my tip is around something that I'm really passionate about, and that has come up on your podcast before too, like the awesome episode with Asia Corbett. But I think it's important to emphasize how important it is to have a good data governance strategy and data hygiene process, because it really impacts everything. Even though oftentimes it's like behind the scenes, not everybody, like leadership, is always aware of it or understands the value, but it really affects everything from speed to lead to reporting and analytics to legal with opt-in rules. But ultimately just empowers the company to drive more revenue. And there are a lot of repercussions of not having it in place and dealing with tech debt, which I think we can talk a lot more in depth. But so just like having hot leads like contact us, not getting to sales fast enough or at all, resulting in a lost potential deal, or having multiple conflicting automations if the process hadn't been thought of in advance, like in different systems that all update records, but there's no documentation about what data updates are being made and on which objects. So things like that, it's very time consuming and costly for someone coming in or like inheriting the system to try to untangle what's happening. Just some of the
what do you think are some of like the biggest issues in data that you see, especially across like when we go into a new instance or in your past experience? Like, do you think it's more around like the lack of governance and there's a lot of different fields for different things, or do you feel like that it's also lacking a strategy, and is there particular places where you feel like the data is like the worst, like, that's impacting their data?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, but definitely not having documentation in place about what processes and what automations are happening. But a lot of data gaps and incompleteness in key fields that are needed for essential things like scoring or routing or lifecycle tracking. not being able to segment and target key audiences correctly because of this. Like we've seen hundreds or even thousands of arbitrary fields that have been created over time and are no longer used. It might be contributing to like a sync delay between, let's say, Salesforce marketing automation platform. So it just affects a lot of like the whole process, and then it's just countless hours lost trying to troubleshoot the order of operations if there's issues of how leads are being processed or if there's a sync delay between all the systems.
For sure.
Yeah, I love this one is so important. We've all talked about this before, where if you think about what we do in MOPS, so much of it is data, because everything we're working in is just databases that do stuff basically.
Right.
And it's like syncing databases together, using database, like be able to run actions on databases. And if your data's wrong, you're gonna, like you said, have bad analytics, make bad decisions. You're going to be losing, high value opportunities. There's some real impacts to the bottom line that I think, like you perfectly put, that sometimes the leadership doesn't get it and they don't understand quite how bad their data is or can be, and then the ramifications of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the word's starting to get out there now, but 2022 needs to be the year that I think companies start taking this seriously, because I think when you're in a lot of the weeds, like we are day to day, you actually see just how bad a lot of data can get.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just some tips for maintaining a data governance strategy is always documenting, to have it, like, even if it's just a Google Doc, or, I mean, we like whimsical, but document how data comes into the various systems and how it's updated by all the MarTech tools, what automations are in place, and always keep it updated too. It's not like a one-time thing and forget it. Always having a change log, especially for large changes impacting the database. Like if you're implementing a new lead scoring model or you're making changes, always keep a record of what the update was, which systems were impacted, where the automation lives, who made the update. I think that's good for historical purposes too, for someone coming in and trying to figure out what's going on. Maintaining a data dictionary with key fields so the team knows what are the right fields to use, especially if you have an older CRM and marketing automation platform with lots of fields that might have been created for similar purposes. And also having a list upload template to make sure leads are created with at least the minimum required information, including lead source. So just some tips.
Do you have any tips on the change log and data dictionary and how to keep that up to date, and just like where you well, if someone wanted to start one tomorrow, like where should they create it? How should they make sure it's updated?
Yeah, for the change log especially, I feel like it's important that it's a joint effort. Like if you have a sales ops team or a bigger revenue ops team, have everybody put in their updates in a single place, so that it's not just marketing automation or your marketing operations team putting in changes, because it affects different systems. Like your sales ops team should be putting in the changes in that place as well. So every time, even if it's just a Google Doc, just anytime there's a change, have a place to document what the change was and what systems it's going to impact.
I feel like that could fit into kind of the product MOPS method of releases too, because if you have like a documentation of every release you've done, you have all of those big milestones and big changes documented already.
Definitely.
Along with what Chrissy just said with releases and even just with tech debt, is I've always found that if you do releases, it's always important to try to dedicate a percentage of every release to addressing some sort of tech debt, so that you don't get behind and you don't end up with hundreds and hundreds of fields. And then also on the data dictionary side of things, one thing that I think is super helpful too is just to make sure that your data dictionary includes, like, what are the possible values of that field? How is it populated? What objects it's on? Because a lot of times people are pulling reports, and this is something that we always recommend with the analytics framework. It's like when they're pulling reports, they think, oh, the name of this field kind of makes sense for what I'm looking for, so I'm just going to use this field, even though I have no idea how it gets populated, and it might be a legacy field that's no longer being used. So, yeah.
Totally. I think my last thing on this too is, and it's one thing actually, Nina, we chat about with us clients, or we'll talk about implementing sometimes for a client is like maybe even having like a monitoring dashboard that you can create, especially if you know that there's certain key fields that you want to monitor and have that there. And so that becomes a bit more proactive than reactive. And then to Allison, to what you said around addressing tech debt, but also, and making that a regular thing, but also around like data and data governance, like how can you just make that part of like your regular process, whether it's like purging, bad data, or going back and doing a review process, reviewing page layouts. There's a bunch of things, but I think getting to like a regular cadence of doing that is super important. And I think that some companies or some people, and it's really normal, it's like part of what we want to do. We always want to get to the next best thing. We want to be like really innovative. We want to be working on big things. But a lot of the times, like you need to address the foundations first. So, some people are like, oh, I want to do this thing and I want to be able to report this way. And it's like, well, you can't really do that with your foundation that is like lacking, and so I think being okay with really making sure your fundamentals and your foundation are spot on and perfect is just as important, because it'll let you get to that next best thing. Like you need to go through, your intermediate classes of, yoga or something before you can be a master. Like it's just, you have to be okay with progression and knowing that you can get there, but you can't get there without that foundation. So, all right. So next, Matt, first time on the podcast as well, I think, right?
Yes, first time podcaster. So mine is actually a super, super broad tip, which you could apply it to practically anything, but just to always question. I feel like sometimes we can get nervous to ask questions like, maybe I should already know this, or there's a set of assumptions that's well established at this company, and so I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to roll with things. But the worst thing that happens when you ask a question is you learn something. But most of the time, I think you not only will you learn something, but other people will benefit from you asking the question, because they have to kind of reevaluate their thinking. And maybe that thinking is either no longer applicable, or maybe it could use some refinement, or maybe they actually haven't thought it through and they were assuming too from 3 generations ago, and it's just kind of something that was passed on and on and on. So I feel like asking questions like very intentionally and liberally, and like going that extra step to probe is something that's super important. I was kind of the annoying kid that was always asking, why? And then my mom would answer why. And I'd say, well, why? And just like keep on going. And I think I've grown up a little bit, but I feel like that's just a super helpful process to be able to go through that. And kind of a specific area where I kind of have a reaction to it and really want to probe is whenever I hear the term best practices. I feel like a lot of times that's something that is kind of I feel like that term is sometimes used as a crutch to say that like, oh, somebody else did it, so we're just going to do it also because it must be best for us. Or I saw it work this one time, so it's definitely going to work here. And I think it can mask a lot of lack of knowledge, or it can mask a lot of maybe due diligence that was not done. So whenever I hear the term best practice, I kind of want to dig in and understand, is that actually the best practice for you, or can you build something better? And so that's kind of my big takeaway is just always ask questions. And when you do, I think that's the process of discovery that will help you to build the best things that you can build. So that's mine.
Yeah, I think along the lines of asking questions too, like just using common sense and like trying to think like, if I think logically about like what we're trying to do, does what everyone is saying we're supposed to do make sense with this situation? Like a lot of times in marketing, people think like you're supposed to do certain things a certain way, because of like these complex reasons. But like, if you think logically or use common sense about it, it's like, maybe that's not the best solution. So I think just like, in addition to questioning things, like just also think about like logically or common sense, like what should we do here? What makes the most sense?
Yeah, that kind of even goes back to what you mentioned, Christy, around like prioritization a few minutes ago, and the roadmap is like kind of like, why is this even a priority? Is almost kind of
Yeah.
be the first question to even then limit needing to ask any more questions about that thing. But I had a question for you, Matt. When you've been working with us now since the summer, and you were in-house before that, have you felt this need to ask more questions, maybe more being a consultant than you did in-house, or do you think it's the same? Or any thoughts around that at all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I feel like being in a consulting role, there are well, I guess I'll start with, I think you need to ask questions in both environments. Absolutely. There's a little bit different dynamic, I think, though, where like when you're in-house and you're getting up to speed in-house, I feel like, I don't know if other people experience this, but I feel like there's like a period of time where I feel I can ask whatever questions I want to ask, and it's free game because it's assumed that I'm new. But after I've been there for some arbitrary period of time that I invented in my mind, that now I should be the expert and I should know it all and I can't ask questions anymore. So I think the first thing is, I've noticed that myself. Don't do that. It's always okay to ask questions. And then something that I think, I guess it kind of translates to being a consultant is, we're constantly being introduced to new clients or to new systems or new projects. And I think because of that, it's not only kind of more, at least in my mind, more accepted to ask those questions, but almost expected that part of the consulting process is that we're being brought in to ask the questions, to challenge the assumptions, to dig deeper than they've been able to dig on their own, kind of thing. So I think it's kind of one of those aspects of consulting that I really enjoy, is the freedom and kind of the expectation to ask those questions. The flip side of it, though, is sometimes I feel like I can feel in the back of my mind that set of assumptions or that feeling that I should be an expert at this already. I can feel that kind of like scratching the back of my mind and trying to prevent me from asking a question. So regardless of whether you're in-house or in a consulting role, try to kill that temptation to stifle your questions. Because you won't learn unless you ask. So
yeah, I like that a lot. And it goes back to what I said about stages of development, right? That's the discovery stage is there for a reason. That's the question stage, and you should be asking tons of questions at that stage, and there shouldn't be a limit on the questions, because the more information you get, then the better the strategy proposal will be. And then the less you've missed, and then you have to go and address afterwards. So that's great.
One thing I would add too, because like early on in my career, I often would ask why, and sometimes I'd get an answer like, because that's what leadership wants, and not really get that answer. So I even made a promise to myself, if I was ever in a role in the future where I was asked why, or had direct reports or whatever it was, that I would go the extra mile if you're on the flip side of the person providing the information, to give the background behind a decision or give the background behind why something is built. And so just doing that due diligence if you're ever in the position of providing the information, because I just found that so important as I was, made my way through marketing ops and my career path, is that always wanting to know why, but also providing others with the answer too.
Totally. I think that's just a good lesson in general, especially like for leadership and stuff like that, because I think the less information that people have, the more assumptions that they make. And then the less information that they have, those assumptions might be wrong. So, which can also lead to maybe some misdirected frustration. And so But once we have more of the thinking behind the decision making, then we are able to produce more empathy, which even if we don't agree with something, if we understand maybe the decision for why it was made, we're more okay with it. Our frustration goes down and we're able to kind of move forward. And I think a lot of, like you said, as a leader, I think that's a great thing to do because, you might not 100% agree with the decision being made. And so like, it's likely that your direct report might, but if you are letting them know, okay, this was made for this reason, you both can empathize. And so I think there's a lot of things that people don't see when something goes into decision making. There's lack of resources. There's, lack of time. There's external pressures. And I think it's super important. It's one of the things actually that when you come into a new instance or when you take over after someone's already been there, at CS2, we have a lot of empathy and try not to just think differently about that person. Oh man, why did they make this decision? Why did they do this way? There's probably reasons for it. So don't take that against that person. But yeah, Matt, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of double click on one of the things you said. So like when you don't necessarily agree with the decision, I feel like in those situations, it's almost even more important that you understand why. Because when you do agree, you're going to fill in a lot of gaps because you think you're of the same mind, you have the same assumptions, and so you're just going to do it the way that you would do it. And so it's kind of easier to go through something when you're in agreement. But when you're in disagreement, I feel like it's that much more important to really understand where that person's coming from and why they made the decision they did, so that you can maybe align to those reasons. So as a high level example is like a quantity versus quality type of conflict. Maybe I'm all about quality, but the decision was made to focus on quantity. So if that's the kind of paradigm you're in, now I need to adjust my thinking in the way I'm going to build towards quantity. And it means that I'm going to sacrifice those other things with all those other decisions that I'm going to make. Even though I disagree with that top level choice, I can at least align to the decision making kind of path. So
totally. I think too, one of the things that with like the asking questions and sometimes I've gotten this a lot too, where it's like, why are you asking this question that's nothing to do with like, what they're telling you to do? Like, I'll just try and understand the strategy and I'll try and question too, because you actually might uncover a misunderstanding. It's like, oh, I want to run this program this way. Well, why do you want to do that? And it even goes back to your thing, like, oh, best practices. Like, oh, I'm doing it because I read it in this thing and it told me that this was a best practice. And it's like, and so as a marketing ops person, a lot of the times we get told, don't be just like the donut maker. Don't just like do exactly what you're told. And this questioning and the understanding and thinking about the strategy is 100% supportive to negate that, right? Like, let's get away from that. Let's really be a partner to these people that are coming up with your campaign ideas or strategy. And you see it all, you see a lot. And so you are 100%, valid for bringing up things that you're worried about, or also understanding and trying to give them some education. And it should be a give and take. And so it's just a great thing to do, especially to elevate yourself, I think. All right. Next up, Maddie.
But mine pretty much goes right along with Matt's tip. And it's not only question, but always try and think outside the box, because going back to those best practices and, it may have been done this way for the past few years or months or whatever, or this is how your last company did it, or this is how the old instance did it, or this is even how Marketo tells you to do it in their blog. Like, there are so many ways that campaigns and programs and just issues can play out, and there's so many ways to get to the same outcome that I've found over the year. And it's always the best just to think about the big picture and think about all of the things coming into your process in your time. And you need to think about every single touch point in that process, and then what's the most efficient way to get around this. And it may be a best practice to do it this way, but this way may be more efficient, but maybe the best practice is the right way because of certain outcomes down the line. Like we said earlier, I know we were talking about different things come from different scenarios, and then you may not know that all of these issues tumble into one thing down the road. You never know how the factory is affecting the ocean down the river. So it's always good to think about the big picture and how everything is flowing
Totally.
together.
I think one thing to add to that, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was talking about like a finite mindset versus an infinite. And when you're in more of a finite mode, you're always like kind of leaning into like whatever's like feeling comfortable or is known and what you've done before and is expected. And I think we see this a lot with some people. Like they come in, they're like, this isn't the tech stack that I'm used to. I need to just implement everything now that I want. And every MOPS person on this call is like, oh God, I know that I feel that, like, and you're just like, oh, replace this tool, or I want this thing, or I did it this way at my last company, like what you said. And it just triggers that. But I think also knowing, like with an infinite mindset, that things are constantly changing. And I think COVID showed that 100%, right? Like, yes, before we did events in person, but then you had to quickly pivot. And so when I think people have this idea of like things can change, it doesn't always have to be the same. You have to expect the unexpected. You can be a lot more nimble and agile as a marketer. And marketing ops, you definitely have to feel that, because you may have implemented something a month ago and something changes and you need to fix it. You have to completely replace it. And that can be sometimes either limiting and make you frustrated, or you can move forward and pivot and figure out the best solution and keep going. So I think that trying to focus on more of a infinite and thinking about the future, and always be, new things might show up. But
yeah, so it goes back to just the title. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, I think kind of that kind of piggybacking on the idea of things are always changing is, before the latest best practice, there was a different best practice. And like whenever a best practice gets established, it's because somebody is not taking like the status quo and just accepting it. They're trying something new, and now that worked better, and now that's the new best practice. So in order, like somebody today or tomorrow or the next day is going to create a new a better best practice, and you have to reject kind of the existing kind of knowledge or some level of that in order to be kind of that cutting edge pioneer. So definitely to Maddie's point about thinking outside the box, sometimes, just do the best practice thing because that actually is the best for you right now, or it's the right set of trade-offs, and that makes the most sense for you to do. But sometimes there is a point in where it does make sense to kind of reject that traditional knowledge and try a new thing. And I think kind of along with that too is one aspect of this that we can't forget is that most things there's almost always going to be a trade-off. There's almost never a perfect or a true best. You're constantly trying to balance a lot of different things in operations, and recognizing that every single organization, or even quarter to quarter or year to year, your goals will shift. And so, or your circumstances like COVID will shift. And now you have to take kind of a new assessment of how do I balance things for this new environment. So that's kind of the last piece I wanted to add there.
Totally.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but to piggyback on both what you both just said, I mean, even the title of our podcast is called Forward Thinking, right? So it is all about like thinking forward, like what is the better way to do it, even if, there's a kind of a standard way that a lot of people are doing it. And, one of the great things about marketing ops is that it's such an evolving, fast-paced, changing landscape and environment and workplace to be in and job to have. But at the same time, marketing ops has kind of been in this form of marketing since the kind of rise of Marketo, marketing automation platforms, for about 12-ish years. And there are still a lot of things that maybe people are stuck in their ways in, and that we've been doing for 10 years now. Maybe where there is a better way to do it. So I think you both absolutely nailed it. Yes, there's times when you just need to accept, okay, this is the good way of doing it, and that's fine. But challenging it, asking more questions, and figuring out the why behind things is going to make you really advance and improve and just improve everything that you're doing in your MOps practice. And it's just a mindset that you just have to be in to continually advance in MOps. Otherwise, you're just going to get left behind.
Yeah, a good example of this is Marketo's new release of executable campaigns for me, because it's like I have to take out everything I thought I knew about how to build campaigns and like for executable campaigns, because we know the benefits of controlling the order of operations. And so it's requiring a whole new mindset. So it's like, it's not the most comfortable thing. Like, it's not something I've been doing. So maybe I just want to use request campaigns because that's familiar. But when you find something new that can be really powerful and have great results, like, flipping the switch there.
One thing just to add on to that too is oftentimes, because there are so many different ways, like Maddie said, to get to the same outcome. Like you could build a process all in Marketo, or you could build a process all in Salesforce, and they both kind of do the same thing, but trying to find the most like efficient, scalable way to build something. Mm-hmm. And it's even what I would consider even an argument for RevOps, or at least a coalition of the willing of all the managers of those tools to work together to design the best, most efficient solution across the tools. Because oftentimes I'll find like an inefficient process because, the marketing ops person only had access to Marketo, so they built it in Marketo when actually part of it should have been built in Salesforce, or could have been built in Salesforce to make it more efficient. So things like that to be aware of.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such an important point. And I mean, it's even how we built this agency around the fact that, maybe 10 years ago, you could be a Marketo agency and that's all you did. But you just can't do that anymore because there are 50 tools plugging into Marketo. There's Salesforce, and there's all the tools plugging into Salesforce. And you have to understand that whole solutions architecture to be able to build the proper architecture that's going to scale and really enable the business. And if you're focusing in just one silo, you're missing a huge picture of things today. It's just, you can't build what the company needs by focusing just in one place for exactly the reason you said, Alison. So I think it's super important for people in-house to recognize that and try and expand their role. Like we always say, if you're a MOps person and you're not doing work or collaborating with sales ops and understanding the Salesforce architecture, that's first, but you got to get in there and understand what's going on there. And I've even seen some MOps teams that don't even have access to Salesforce, which just blows my mind. But you've got to start expanding that scope to really understand the whole architecture of your systems. Otherwise, you're missing a trick.
Yeah. One thing that a few people said on this call is mindset. And actually, I took a note also this morning in my notes, and it was even around, best practices aren't effective unless you understand the mindset behind it. And I think that one of the things that I would say for marketing ops people is, instead of focusing on best practices or the exact way to do something, yes, I do think that those are important. But I think going into your next year is like, what's the mindset that's going to help me with even adopting those best practices? And so we talk about product MOPS, and I highly suggest that, listeners go back and listen to some of those podcasts. And I talked about it on various podcasts last year, including the Drift Operations podcast with Sean Lane. But I think a lot of that mindset and the is going into it of like having a process, knowing that you're going to tie your work to business objectives, and there are features that tie to these outcomes that you can track. But really, like, if we just say alone, it's just, apply the mindset to your work that it's going to be iterative. You're going to be working on features. It's going to be an ongoing thing. And you want to be tracking that back to an outcome that makes sense for the business and then communicating that back. And so I think if we just go into this mindset to be a bit more thoughtful, some of you even said slow down, ask questions, prioritize. This mindset, or whatever was talking about on this call, that could be a mindset. And so going into 2022, slow down, ask the questions, gather requirements, be the thought leader, provide feedback. Everyone's like, gather the requirements. Everyone from Ruben to Maddie, everyone on the call has the mindset behind it is really, instead of being reactive, try and be more proactive and slow down, and that'll make you have more of an impact. So maybe the last of for me and you, Charlie, I don't know if you want to share your lesson next, but we can end with one from each other. Do you want to go?
Do you want me to go next?
Yeah.
Then you can go do yours and then kind of sign off.
Yeah,
I'll keep mine really short. Mine's just basically everything everyone said encapsulated into our product MOPS methodology. So if you don't know what product MOPS is, I think we've done a couple of podcasts on it now. But essentially, it's just how you can work like a product team and all the benefits that marketing operations teams can get through working like a product team. Mm-hmm. With the key one being prioritization and really working on the most important work, because you can optimize and be effective at doing the wrong things. That's not going to end up actually being effective. So I actually saw a post on LinkedIn today by Darren Alfonso, who was on the podcast a while back. And I thought it kind of summed it up quite nicely. He said, I fell in love with marketing ops when I found that I could integrate and configure technology to solve problems. I became effective at marketing ops when I learned how to pick the right problems to solve. I thought that was pretty well articulated. And I think that's kind of where you should start. Are you working on the right things? Mm-hmm. If you are, then you can optimize the way to work on those things. But you need to make sure you're working on the right things. And that comes down to prioritization and roadmap, which is the P&R in product MOPS. So that's my tip. And honestly, everything everyone said perfectly, aligns to all of that. So it's been great.
And my one thing for that I had to learn, I'm sure everyone did, is don't let, and this is hard, especially when you're working with clients. And so I will say this is a fine balance, but don't let other people try to convince you that their most important thing is the thing that's most important to work on. Don't let them prioritize your roadmap for you, especially if they're not in your organization. And so the loudest person in the room is not the most important person. The project that maybe seems most important at that exact moment. I've had cases where even someone's tried to say, oh, we need to make sure everyone's name is capitalized in the database. And I'm like, what? Yes, that's important if it's going to solve a certain problem. If it's a really big problem, you want to do personalization, but let's think more big picture than that. And some of those things can come from people outside of your organization. So you're the best person. Your team is the best person, especially if you're collaborating Allison said with other teams or your RevOps team. You're going to be the best people to decide who, what projects should be prioritized. So, all right, mine, let's see, my tip. I think this is my tip, especially for people working in house. And I was reminded about it this week with I was doing a podcast recording with Senior Director of Field Operations at Drift, Sean Lane, and he was talking about his history, and he actually started out as an SDR manager, and moved into different roles. And he talked about his tour of duties and how that had made him a better operations person because he had more empathy for those people he was supporting, because he's been in their roles. He was an SDR manager and then was in field operations. So he knew how to support that person because he had that empathy. Without having to do a bunch of different roles in a company, although I think that can be really powerful if you're working in demand gen and ops or you try other parts. one of the ways to develop that also is like working closely with your stakeholders and really trying to understand them. And in some cases, like even at a personal level too, or trying to build those relationships. And so my tip is to try and find a few of your key stakeholders and develop a more frequent, meeting with them and develop that relationship. And that can be in a more like tactical way where maybe you are meeting weekly and discussing, how can you support them, any issues that might coming up and so forth. Or it can be really just for just understanding and getting a good pulse. So my two people I would suggest if you're in marketing operations is like the SDR manager, like whoever's leading the SDRs. Mainly because the SDR team, if you have one, is like the closest next person to understanding if your marketing ops or process is effective. You hear about the problems with data or, campaign structure or and a lot of what we do is to make sure that team's effective, speed to lead and so forth. And so I always find having a relationship with those people is super effective. I even used to take the train every morning with our SDR manager at a last job. And I can't even tell you how many times, like just walking to get coffee with her in the morning, like just helped me. I was like, wow, thank you for telling me that. I need to go fix that, and that wasn't even a meeting inside the walls of our org. And then another person is just your CMO or head of demand gen, just someone who's like kind of in control of like the strategy and the data and reporting side, because one, you understand like what their goals are, which can make you better effective at prioritizing. Two, you get a better understanding of like what are their pain points, especially on the reporting side. And if there's one thing that we say to elevate your role in MOPS is to try and get more aligned onto the measurement, reporting, analytics side, because you really then hold the keys to the kingdom at that point, I think. So, but yeah, that's my tip.
Yeah, one thing that came to mind when you were talking about the SDRs is the U in product in our product MOPS method, which is user experience. And I think given kind of the great resignation, like the difficulties around hiring, retaining talent these days, one aspect I think that not many MOPS people think about is their impact on employee retention, both the sales team and the marketing team. Like, think how many people have left the job in marketing and sales because the SDR thinks, okay, I never have any good data. The leads are getting lost. The process is just way too arduous and I just can't get my job done, or I don't have the tools that I need. Same with the marketing team. They think, I don't have the data to be able to run campaigns. I'm not able to know if my campaigns are working or not. I'm going to go somewhere else. So if you think about, one of the, the O in product is outcomes. If you think about one of the outcomes that you can really impact, it's really just the experience for your internal team. And to be able to work cross-functionally, understand their pain points, improve that experience, and be able to, I would even go so far as to try and track retention rates and, tenure at your company and see if you've just started, what was it the last 12 months? Once you've made some improvements, has that improved? You might not be the only thing that improved that, but potentially you have. And especially if you do surveys for your sales and marketing team once every 6 months on the process and the way that they kind of interact and use data and enjoy their job, and if you've had an impact on that, you could go to your CMO and say, look, I'm saving you a lot of issues with people leaving, a lot of issues with a lot of time and effort in recruiting, and that's going to really I want to get more resources to build out my team more, so we can just do more of that. And I think one of the things that we don't really think about in MOPS, but it's always been true, especially in 2022.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking back to my first role in marketing operations. I sat in the middle of the SDR sales pit, and just having that awareness of hearing their conversations day and out, hearing their just commentary between each other and about, man, this event was really great, or maybe this event was not so great, and why, and just having be kind of my ear to their experience and the things that they were struggling with. was hugely helpful for me in marketing ops to be able to understand what do they need from us, what are we maybe not performing at very well, or maybe could we just alter something small that would make their life a million times easier. So having that awareness, and for me, not in a COVID era where I was in an HQ and had the ability to sit in the middle of that sales pit was really helpful. But I know, Chrissy, I think you've mentioned before that you have intentionally kind of held open kind of office hours where people from the marketing team, or maybe outside the marketing team, would be able to come by your desk, or in this day and age, hop on a Zoom and be able to just ask you questions. I think that even something like that is really helpful because you're able to help them feel like they're heard, and you actually are hearing from that end user, within the organization about what they need. So that I think would be a really good way to kind of execute on this, to make sure that you are. And also, if you're not able to measure something like retention rates, you can kind of take a little bit of like a little bit of a weather check to figure out, how are they feeling about it? Is sentiment improving? So that's one way, I think, just to kind of measure that as well.
Yeah, 100%. When I worked at Marketo, we were next to the SDRs, and I loved it. And then they moved and they went to a different floor. And especially every Friday, I would actually just take my laptop and work out of space right next to them, just proactively, because I knew that it was an effective thing to do still. And especially because I was so working closely on operationalizing ABM. We didn't call it back then, but then, so I wanted that feedback there. And I love the office hours idea. I think in COVID, we're always looking for those things that we can do, and don't let not being right next to that person get in your way. So, this was awesome. I love this episode. I feel like we're going to have to do these more often. But it's a great way to spend our 100th episode, just having the whole CS2 team here on the call. So thanks everyone for joining today and celebrating with us. And we'll see you on the next episode of Forward Thinking. If you enjoyed this, share it with your colleagues and friends. And see you next time. All right. See ya.